It had rained earlier, and the sky was still heavy with the weight of gray. But inside the top floor of Keen Systems International, everything was polished to perfection. The floors gleamed like glass beneath custom Italian leather shoes. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, overlooking Chicago like a god might look over a miniature kingdom. Detached, immovable, distant. Phones buzzed at precise intervals. Assistants murmured in low tones. And the only sound louder than the HVAC hum was the echo of control. Hollis Keene liked it that way. He liked precision. He liked knowing that nothing entered his space uninvited. Nothing touched his world unless he allowed it. That's why when the glass doors of his private office opened without warning, something inside him immediately paused. His executive assistant Meredith rushed behind the woman, her voice tinged with panic and disbelief. "Sir, I told her she couldn't." But the woman had already crossed the threshold, not pausing at the desk or waiting for permission, not hesitating like people usually did when facing Hollis Keene, the man who'd turned cybersecurity into an empire. She simply walked in. She looked out of place at first glance. Her coat was slightly damp from the rain and clearly secondhand. Her boots were scuffed. Her hair was long, pulled into a practical braid, and her posture was more defiant than composed. But there was something in her face, something still and fierce that made Hollis stand. He hadn't meant to. It was instinct, like a deep part of him recognizing something he didn't yet understand. Her eyes, gray like thunderclouds, fixed on him, and she spoke with a calmness that didn't match the tremor he now felt building in the back of his neck. "You ruined my mother's life," she said, "and I think I'm your daughter." The sentence didn't land like a slap. It landed like silence after an explosion. The kind of silence where dust is still falling and no one has checked yet if they're bleeding. Hollis didn't speak. His mind reached backward, instantly, violently. Her mother. Her mother. Who was her? The woman reached into her coat and produced a folder, worn at the edges. She walked to the desk and set it down without flinching. "I'm not here for a lawsuit. I'm not here for money. But I need to know the truth. And you do too." Meredith hovered in the doorway, uncertain whether to call security or apologize. Hollis raised a hand slowly, without looking at her. "Give us a minute," he said, his voice even but quieter than usual. The assistant hesitated, then disappeared. He stared at the folder on the desk but didn't open it. Instead, his eyes returned to the woman in front of him. "What's your name?" "Sable," she replied. "Sable Marin." The world for a moment collapsed inward. The office, the company, the layers of suits and advisors and negotiations, all of it blurred at the edges as her last name registered. "Marin. Your mother was Rowan?" he asked, and the sound of her name on his lips tasted like something forbidden and half forgotten. He hadn't said that name out loud in over 20 years. Sable nodded. "She died 2 years ago. Stage 4 lymphoma. She didn't talk about you much. But the week before she passed, she gave me a journal and a photo of the two of you. She said, he never knew. He would have ruined everything if he had. And then she told me your name." His heart pounded in a way that made his ribs feel foreign. "How did you find me?" "I'm a researcher," she said with a shrug. "Part-time violinist, full-time curiosity addict. Google helped. You're not exactly hiding." He couldn't help but let out a breath that was almost a laugh, except it died before it reached the air. Hollis stepped back and gestured toward the chair in front of his desk. "Sit." She did, carefully. He followed and lowered himself into his own chair, but suddenly the leather felt too rigid, the office too artificial. He'd built this room like a fortress, but now it felt exposed, almost vulnerable. He reached for the folder she'd left and opened it. Inside, there was a copy of a birth certificate, Sable Marin, born July 5, 1998, no father listed. A handful of printed emails and a black and white photo of a girl who looked so painfully like her mother, it stole his breath. Then clipped to the back, a sheet of paper bearing the unmistakable format of a DNA test. "You took my DNA?" he asked, looking up. "I didn't steal it," she replied. "You had lunch at the Wren Hotel last March. You left a napkin. I was there. It was clean enough." Hollis stared at her, somewhere between awe and dread. "You've been watching me. I needed to be sure. And it's a match. 98%. He leaned back slowly, feeling the air shift. There was no denying it. No escape hatch. This wasn't a lawsuit or an accusation. It was biology. It was consequence. It was history crashing into the present without an invitation. He rubbed his jaw, not realizing until now that his hands were trembling slightly. "So what do you want?" Sable crossed one leg over the other. Her voice was level, but there was something behind it, something raw and waiting. "I told you, I don't want your money. I don't want your name. I've survived just fine without either. But I want the truth. I want to know who you were before the press releases. I want to know why you left her. I want to know what kind of man chooses an empire over a woman who loved him. And I want to know why I had to find you, why you never looked." There it was. The rupture. The one thing even billions couldn't buffer. Hollis looked at her, really looked at her. She was his. Not in the way of possession, but in the way time sometimes circles back with a face you were never meant to forget. A daughter. His daughter. And she was everything he had once walked away from, staring him in the face with a question that had no easy answer. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Hollis Keene had no idea what to say. The office, once designed to be the epitome of minimalist control, now felt like a stage where every carefully arranged object was a prop from a life Hollis Keene no longer recognized. The silence between him and Sable stretched long, taut, and unsettling. He'd weathered boardroom wars, government investigations, and billion-dollar negotiations without ever once losing composure. But this wasn't about numbers or control. This was about a choice he had made more than 2 decades ago, a choice that now sat across from him in the form of a grown woman whose existence he had never known, but whose presence was now impossible to ignore. Sable didn't rush him. She sat with her arms folded across her chest, not in defiance but as armor. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held a kind of stillness that was more unnerving than anger. It was the stillness of someone who had already survived the worst of life without the person who should have been there. "I didn't know," he said finally. The words felt clumsy in his mouth, inadequate. "I figured," she replied, her voice steady. "If you had, you would have either shown up or had me erased. Either way, I wouldn't have needed to track you down like this." Her words weren't cruel. They were factual, clinical almost. That made them hit harder. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't know him well enough to say that. But the truth was, she was right. 25 years ago, he might have done either. Back then, before he understood what true loneliness felt like. Before the awards, the stocks, the houses, before the silence of success began to hum louder than any applause. He glanced back down at the folder. "Why now?" he asked. "Why come to me after all this time?" Sable shrugged one shoulder. "Because she's gone, and I'm tired of carrying a story that's only half mine. When she told me about you, it wasn't with bitterness. It was regret. She told me you had a name that people would know by now. Said she almost reached out to you once. That was the last real conversation we ever had." There was a pause. Hollis could hear the blood rushing in his ears. The photo in the folder, the one of Rowan holding a baby, her hair messily pinned up and a tired, blissful smile on her face, mocked him. She'd been young. They both had. When they met, he had just dropped out of Stanford, convinced the traditional path would suffocate him. Rowan was an art major, living in a shared loft with no heat and too many houseplants. They had fallen into each other like sparks into dry grass, bright, fast, and destined to burn out. He had loved her, or at least he had loved what she gave him. Freedom, rawness, the belief that he could be someone beyond what his father expected him to be. But love hadn't been enough for him, not then. Ambition had always been louder. When his company got its first major investment, he told Rowan he needed space, that he couldn't build a future if he was chained to a past. He remembered her face when he left. She hadn't cried. She hadn't begged. She'd only said, "Then go. Just don't come back when it gets cold." He had thought she meant emotionally cold. He hadn't realized until now how literal that warning had been. "You're not what I expected," he said aloud, his eyes lifting to Sable again. "You're sharper." "I had to be," she said, her voice cutting through the air like glass. "Growing up without answers turns you into a collector. Of details, of silences, of the way people look at you when you tell them your father isn't in the picture." "I didn't choose that," he said a little too quickly. "No," she said. "You chose not to look back. And it turns out that was enough." Hollis leaned forward, elbows on the desk, steepling his fingers like he did when he needed to slow a meeting down, control the narrative. But this wasn't a meeting. This was an unraveling. "What do you do?" he asked, more to shift the current than to probe. "I teach music at a community center," she said. "Mostly violin, sometimes piano. I play freelance gigs when I can get them. Weddings, gallery nights, one time a corporate launch event for a startup that paid me in champagne and exposure." That last part stung. Hollis had built his fortune on those events, on underpaying talent to impress venture capitalists. He had sat at tables with people who saw art as an accessory. He hadn't realized until now that people like his daughter were the ones being crushed beneath those tables. "Do you like it?" he asked. "Some days. Others, I feel like I'm screaming into a void that's too loud to hear me." He understood that too well. They sat there, the space between them narrowing not from comfort, but from shared discomfort. He wanted to offer her something, an apology, a chance, a future, but he didn't know how to do that without sounding performative. Everything in his life was wrapped in performance. Genuine moments were rare, buried under layers of image and transaction. "I can't change what I didn't know," he said eventually, "but I'm here now. That counts for something, doesn't it?" Sable gave him a long, assessing look. Then she stood. "I didn't come for change, or even redemption. I came for clarity. Now I have it." "Will you come back?" he asked. "Do you want me to?" He paused. Then with a gravity that surprised even him said, "Yes." Sable nodded once, a subtle movement, but not without meaning. "Then we'll see." And then she turned and walked out the same way she had entered, without ceremony, without permission, leaving behind the pieces of a life he didn't know he'd broken until she handed them to him. When the door clicked shut behind her, Hollis stayed frozen for a long time. Then slowly, he reached for the photograph in the folder again and touched the face of the woman who had once loved him enough to stay silent forever. And for the first time in over 20 years, he said her name aloud. "Rowan." It didn't feel like forgiveness. It felt like the beginning of grief. The morning after Sable left his office, Hollis Keene stood in his penthouse kitchen, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. He hadn't slept. He had replayed their conversation over and over in his mind like a corrupted recording, skipping in loops at key words. "You ruined her life. I think I'm your daughter. She's gone. I just want the truth." The lines had burned themselves into his memory, each one opening a door he'd bolted shut decades ago. The condo around him was pristine, too clean to feel lived in, as if someone had staged it for a magazine shoot and forgotten to add the part where people actually inhabited the space. There were no photos, no mementos, nothing that hinted at a life outside of professional victory. It was a shell, sleek, hollow, and echoing. He sat down at the edge of the bar, not bothering to reheat the coffee. His phone buzzed once, an update from Meredith about a board meeting rescheduled to Thursday. And then again, this time from a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it, but something about the local area code gave him pause. When he opened the message, his breath caught. "Come tonight, 7 p.m. No press, no agenda. If you really want to see who I am." Sable. She didn't include an address, just a venue name, the Forge Room. He had to look it up. It wasn't a place he'd ever heard of. No mention in Forbes, no curated influencer reels, just a black and white website with a single calendar page and an address in a quiet part of the South Side. Underground arts, independent performances, cash bar, no cameras allowed. It was, in short, the exact kind of place Hollis Keene hadn't set foot in since he was a teenager. By 6:40 that evening, he was parked across the street in a car too expensive for the neighborhood. He left it reluctantly, knowing it would draw attention, but also knowing he couldn't not go in. Dressed down in dark jeans and a gray coat, he walked to the entrance and paid at the door. The man at the ticket table gave him a strange look, as though trying to place him. But no one said his name, and that suited him. The Forge Room was dim and intimate, lit mostly by exposed bulbs and the flicker of candles. The air smelled like old wood and red wine, and the stage was only a raised platform, barely 2 feet above the ground. Chairs lined the floor in loose rows, and a quiet hum of anticipation moved through the audience as people settled in. He found a seat in the back, far from the stage lights, and waited. At exactly 7:03, she walked out. No one announced her. She didn't smile. She carried a worn violin and wore a deep green dress that moved like smoke when she stepped forward. She didn't look for him. She didn't need to. She knew he was there. For a moment, she simply stood there, eyes closed, bow resting at her side. Then, without introduction, she began to play. The first note was soft, but struck with precision, like a breath too long held. The melody that followed was haunting, unresolved chords that clashed and circled, occasionally brushing beauty before descending into something darker. It wasn't classical. It wasn't contemporary. It was raw, improvised, full of things words couldn't hold. Hollis didn't know music well, not technically, but he knew emotion. And this was grief, rage, memory, loneliness shaped into sound. About halfway through, she changed tempo. The notes turned faster, almost violent, then slowed again, like the crash of waves pulling back to sea. The piece ended with a single, suspended note that hovered in the air for a full second after she dropped her bow. The room was dead silent. Then the applause came, not thunderous but honest. A real acknowledgement of something too personal to clap for loudly. Hollis clapped too, slowly, quietly, then stopped when she looked up, directly at him. Her face didn't change. She gave him nothing, but that nothing was everything. After the set ended and the lights dimmed, he stayed seated. He didn't follow her backstage or try to insert himself into the crowd offering praise. Instead, he waited until the space had nearly emptied, until only staff remained cleaning glasses and wiping down chairs. She came to him then, wordless, holding her case in one hand, her coat slung over the other. "I didn't come for a review," she said softly. "I know," he replied, "but I came for the truth. And I think I just heard it." She didn't smile, but something in her expression loosened. Not warmth exactly, but a small release of tension. "Music's easier than talking," she said. "People hear what they want. They don't ask questions." He nodded. "But I have questions." "I figured." She glanced toward the bar. "They close in 15. You want answers? You'll buy me a drink." He followed her to the bar where she ordered whiskey neat and gestured for the same for him. They sat on the far end, away from the bartender's earshot. "Why music?" he asked. "It's the only thing that made silence bearable growing up," she said. "When I didn't know why my mom would stare out the window too long, when she'd come home from her second shift and forget to eat, when I didn't know why I felt, not abandoned exactly, but missing something I couldn't name." Hollis looked down at his drink. "You were never a mistake." "I know," she said, "but you were still gone." They sipped in silence. The lights overhead flickered once. Hollis set his glass down. "She never told me," he said. "If she had, I don't know what I would have done back then. But I can tell you now, if I had known, if I'd seen you even once, I wouldn't have left again." Sable leaned forward, elbows on the bar. Her voice was quieter now. "That's the problem with your generation of men. You always think love is enough when it's already too late." He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, because it was true. "I'm not here for redemption," she added, "but I do think you should know something." "What's that?" "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I've survived this long without you. But now that I know who you are, and that you're human, I want to decide for myself if there's room for you in my life." Hollis looked at her, and for the first time in decades, someone wasn't trying to win him, sue him, flatter him, or fear him. She was giving him a choice, not to be forgiven, but to be allowed in. He lifted his glass in a quiet salute. "To beginnings?" She considered it, then clinked her glass gently to his. "To boundaries," she said. And for the first time since she'd walked into his office with 10 words and a history he hadn't known he left behind, he laughed. Not performatively, not politely, but because she was right. This was going to be hard, and it was going to be worth it. The days that followed were unlike anything Hollis Keene had experienced in decades. Not because of upheaval. He'd been through hostile takeovers and federal audits. He knew how to survive chaos. But this was something quieter, more intimate, and far more difficult to navigate. It was the slow unraveling of a version of himself he had carefully constructed over the years, brick by brick, from ambition and detachment. It was being seen, truly seen for the first time since his early 20s, and realizing the person looking back wasn't impressed. She wasn't here to be dazzled by his wealth or his world. She wasn't another merger to win. She was his daughter. And she was watching him with the critical eyes of someone who had grown up in his absence, with no illusions to break. Sable didn't disappear after their night at the forge room, but she didn't rush to integrate him into her life either. She set boundaries, firm ones. They would meet once a week. No press, no public gestures, no money. If he offered to fund her music program again, she would end contact. He accepted her terms without protest, though it pained him more than he admitted. Every instinct he'd honed over his career, fix, invest, dominate, was useless here. Sable couldn't be bought, and she wouldn't be managed. The only way to earn her trust was through consistency, patience, and the one currency he was least familiar with: vulnerability. Their first scheduled meeting after the performance was at a bookstore cafe in Hyde Park. She picked it. No chance of photographers there, no businessmen who'd recognize him. She arrived before him and was already nursing a tea when he walked in, flanked by 2 steps of hesitation and a tension in his shoulders he hadn't carried since his first investor pitch. She wore a deep burgundy sweater and no makeup. Her hair was tied up in a loose bun, and she was scribbling notes in the margins of a weathered sheet of music. When she saw him, she gave a short nod. Not warm, not cold, just permission to sit. He started by asking about her students. She told him about a girl named Juno, who had learned Clair de Lune by ear in less than a month. About a boy named Lucas, who could barely hold a bow, but had perfect pitch. Her eyes lit up when she spoke of them, and he realized that for all her restraint with him, she was open with them. She poured into them the kind of care he suspected she had longed to receive herself. She asked him nothing about his work, and he didn't offer. Instead, she asked, "Did you ever want children?" The question caught him off guard. He answered honestly, "I think I convinced myself I didn't, because wanting them would have required me to be someone I wasn't ready to become." She didn't reply, only nodded and sipped her tea like it confirmed something she already suspected. The conversation turned slowly toward Rowan. Hollis found himself fumbling for words he hadn't said in 25 years. He told her about how they met, Rowan wearing a paint-stained apron in a shared laundry room on the 2nd floor of a student dormitory, blasting Bowie from her Walkman. He'd been drawn to her laugh first, unfiltered, full of something wild. She had made him feel real in a way his tech world didn't. They talked for hours on rooftops, argued about philosophy, made art out of their poverty. But then the funding came, and the pressure and the whispers of what a future looked like. He'd walked away without knowing she was carrying his child. "She must have hated you," Sable said, not unkindly, just as an observation. "No," he replied after a pause. "She pitied me. That's worse." Sable didn't disagree. After that, their meetings became more regular. She would call him when she had time, never on his schedule, always on hers. Sometimes they would walk through the sculpture garden in Grant Park. Other times they sat in silence on benches, watching the lake churn beneath a gray sky. He never pushed. She never asked for more than conversation. But over time, the silence between them grew softer, less like a wall and more like a shared language. Then came the night she invited him to one of her community classes. Not to watch, to participate. He was the only adult in a room full of 11-year-olds. They were skeptical at first. One boy asked if he was her bodyguard. Another whispered to a friend that he looked like some guy who owns a rocket. Hollis, for the first time in decades, felt deeply out of place, but Sable introduced him as a friend who's learning late, but learning anyway, and handed him a triangle. He played it badly. They laughed. He laughed with them. That night, when the kids had gone, and the classroom lights were low, he helped her stack chairs. They didn't speak for a while. Then she turned to him and said, "You're different when you're here." "I'm only me when I'm here," he said, and she nodded like that made sense. The following weekend, he found himself outside the old apartment where Rowan had lived. It was a walk-up above a bodega, still bearing the same cracked green awning from the 90s. The landlord recognized his name, barely, and agreed to let him look inside the unit. It was empty now, stripped bare, but Hollis stood in the doorway and closed his eyes. He remembered the cheap linoleum, the broken faucet in the kitchen, the place where Rowan had taped a Polaroid of them kissing beside the fridge. He could still hear her laugh echoing off the walls, the hum of a violin coming from the back room. The argument they'd had on the night he told her he was leaving. He sank down on the floor where her bed used to be. For a long time, he didn't move. When he got home, he sent Sable a message. "I went to her apartment today. I'm sorry it took me this long." She replied hours later. "I'm not interested in apologies. I'm interested in presence." And with that, he understood what she needed from him. Not regret, not grief, not elaborate gestures. Just to stay. So he did. The following month passed with a strange, delicate rhythm. Not predictable, not routine, but steady. Like a song with no sheet music where two players slowly learn to harmonize by instinct alone. Hollis began carving space in his life for moments that had no strategic value. He turned down a keynote in Berlin. He skipped 2 shareholder dinners. He told his assistant he was unavailable on Wednesday afternoons without explaining why. The truth was that those hours were reserved now. For a violin lesson he never truly took. For a daughter he still barely understood. And for a version of himself he was only just beginning to meet. Sable, for her part, seemed to loosen incrementally. It wasn't affection yet. She still kept him at a measured distance. But she began to send him things. Small things, deliberate things. An article about music therapy and childhood trauma. A photograph of her mother he had never seen, taken in profile as she stood at a bus stop with sunlight wrapped around her. A voice note of a melody Sable had composed at 2 a.m. that she claimed was unfinished and weird, but which made him stop breathing when he listened to it alone in the dark. They met now not just in public cafes but in quieter spaces. She took him once to an abandoned church on the south side, where she sometimes practiced when she needed acoustics that carried pain differently. The roof was partially collapsed. Light streamed through broken stained glass windows, and the air always smelled faintly of ash and wet wood. But when she played there, standing beneath fractured saints with a bow in her hand, she looked like someone standing at the edge of heaven, not afraid to fall. He watched her from a pew, his hands folded between his knees. He never interrupted. He never recorded her. He just listened. Afterward, she asked him if he ever felt silence could be holy. He answered honestly, only when it cost something to hold it. That night, she told him about a boy. Not a boyfriend, not a love story. Just a boy from her teenage years who had tried to save her. He bought her strings when she couldn't afford them, walked her home after late shifts, listened when her mother forgot to. But she had been too close then, too wrapped in survival. She let him go before she ever let him in. "I think he was my first heartbreak," she said. "Not because we loved each other, but because I realized I didn't know how to let someone love me." Hollis didn't speak for a while. Then he said, "You're not the only one who missed learning that." They sat together in the old church until the wind made the windows rattle like a warning, and she tucked her violin back into its case without another word. The next week, Sable invited him to one of her student showcases. It was a modest event held in the basement of a community center, with mismatched folding chairs and stale cookies on a plastic table near the back. The room was crowded with parents, younger siblings, and volunteers. Hollis, who had spent most of his adult life in venues with red carpets and wine lists, stood awkwardly by the door holding a paper cup of juice until Sable waved him toward a seat in the second row. She didn't sit with him. She stood at the side of the stage, clipboard in hand, coaching students as they waited for their turn. But when she looked at him, she nodded, and it meant something. He didn't know what yet, but it was more than approval. It was invitation. The performances were beautiful in the way that only unpolished things can be. Honest, trembling, occasionally off-key but utterly sincere. A boy named Marcus forgot his lines halfway through a cello piece and burst into tears. Hollis instinctively moved to rise, but Sable reached him first, kneeling beside Marcus and whispering something no one else could hear. The boy nodded, wiped his eyes, and began again. After the performance, parents clapped politely, and the children beamed with the kind of pride that only comes when effort is seen and valued. Sable stood by the exit with a clipboard, thanking everyone by name. Hollis waited until the crowd thinned. When she reached him, he didn't speak right away. He simply handed her a folded sheet of paper. She opened it. It was a check, not a donation to her personally, but to the center. Untraceable, private, substantial. "I had it transferred anonymously," he said. "You'll never have to vouch for me, but they won't lose their funding next quarter." She stared at the check for a long time, then finally folded it again and slipped it into her bag. "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know. I didn't give you permission. I know that too. She looked at him. Her eyes were hard to read. Then she said something that made his chest tighten. You're learning. Later that night, he walked the streets of his own neighborhood and felt like a stranger. He passed windows filled with designer furniture and perfect lighting. He passed people who smiled at him out of habit, but none of it felt real. It was Sable's world, the uneven, cluttered, difficult one that was becoming his compass. He thought about Rowan then, and how she must have raised Sable with whatever little she had. He imagined the two of them in small apartments with leaky faucets, Rowan stretching paychecks, making up lullabies. He imagined Sable walking home from school in a worn coat, holding a violin case too big for her hands. And he thought about himself, not just as the man who wasn't there, but as the man who had chosen not to ask what might have been waiting if he had turned around. Before he went to sleep that night, he opened his safe. Not for money, not for documents, but for the one photo he had kept, tucked behind certificates and shares, of Rowan laughing on the beach, wearing his college hoodie and sand between her fingers. He looked at her face for a long time. Then he whispered something he hadn't said in a very, very long time. I'm trying. It wasn't enough, but it was real. And for the first time, that mattered more. It began with a message. At first, nothing more than a vibration in Hollis's pocket as he stood in front of a chalkboard at the community center, helping a small group of students understand the difference between tempo and rhythm. It buzzed twice, paused, then once again, a pattern Meredith used when she marked something urgent. He ignored it initially, too absorbed in watching a kid named Lyle tap out a clumsy beat on a wooden block, eyebrows furrowed in proud concentration. But when the session ended and the room emptied out, when the last of the students ran off toward waiting parents, Hollis checked his phone, and the illusion of peace fractured immediately. The first headline was on a fringe gossip site, the second on a legitimate tech blog. By the third, his name was trending on social media. The story had all the hallmarks of a carefully orchestrated leak, concise, dramatic, and perfectly cruel in its simplicity. Alleged daughter of tech giant Hollis Keene seeks payout. The narrative was surgical. Sable as the opportunistic product of an old college fling, now demanding access to the billionaire's inheritance. Hollis as the emotionally compromised CEO, potentially funneling company resources into an illegitimate bloodline. Photos had been included. Grainy images of Sable exiting the forge room, a screenshot of their DNA results, somehow leaked, paired with a vague legal memo from a source close to the company. He read the articles 3 times before the fury truly began to set in. Not for himself. He could handle scandal, spin, reputational smearing. But Sable, she hadn't asked for this. She had gone out of her way to remain invisible, to maintain control. And someone had torn the curtain away. He knew who. There was only one person with enough venom and institutional access to orchestrate something this surgical. Celeste Darnell, his former PR chief, and at one time, the woman he had briefly allowed into the quieter corners of his life. Celeste was brilliant, ruthless, and dangerously nostalgic. After their relationship had ended, cleanly, he thought, she had remained professionally involved, managing crises with her signature icy poise. But when Sable had appeared, things changed. Celeste had never liked disruptions to Hollis's narrative. He could see her fingerprints all over the story. The cold diction, the carefully chosen quotes, the veiled threat of a company in moral flux. She was sending him a message. She wanted him to choose. And she'd made the first strike. When he called Sable, she didn't pick up. He tried again. Still nothing. Panic bloomed inside his chest. Not the kind of fear he felt during corporate crashes or legal battles, but a visceral, personal kind of dread. The kind that settled deep and cold. The kind he'd only known once before. The day his mother died, and no one had told him until it was too late. He drove across the city in a haze of red lights and clenched fists. Her apartment building loomed ahead, modest and familiar now, but he didn't park in the visitor space. He left the car running, jogged up the stairs 2 at a time, and knocked once. Sharp, urgent, loud enough to be heard behind locked doors. When she answered, her face said everything before her words did. She looked hollow, not tearful, just emptied out like someone who had taken a punch to the chest and hadn't found her breath yet. She didn't move aside to let him in. I know, he said quickly. It wasn't me. I swear to you, Sable, I didn't say anything. I didn't leak anything. I've spent all morning trying to find the source. She leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't even tell my students. I didn't want pity or attention. I didn't want to become anyone's headline. I know, he said again, quieter now. My landlord asked me if I was really your daughter. Someone left a camera on the stoop. My inbox is full of requests for interviews. My violin students' parents are canceling lessons. Hollis took a breath and stepped back slightly, giving her space. Let me fix it. She let out a sound then, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. You think you can fix this? This isn't a software glitch, Hollis. This is my life. Something you weren't in for 25 years. And now, suddenly, you're everywhere. He said nothing. He let the silence hold, the ache grow. Then she asked the question he had been dreading. Why now? He blinked. What do you mean? Why are you doing this now, she said. Why did you open the door when I walked into your office? Why didn't you just deny it? Why didn't you protect yourself? The answer came slowly, rising from a place he hadn't touched in decades. Because I'm tired of living a life that looks good on paper and feels like nothing. Because I've been surrounded by people who see me as a product, an asset, a symbol, and you're the first person who's ever looked at me and wanted nothing but the truth. Because your mother didn't tell me, and that was her right. But now you're here, and I'm not going to waste the chance she never gave me. For a long moment, Sable said nothing. Then she turned and walked back into the apartment. This time she left the door open behind her. He stepped in cautiously. The place was small, books stacked in towers, sheet music scattered across every surface, and a single photograph on the mantel. Her and Rowan, both laughing, heads tilted toward each other as though sharing the same secret. Sable stood at the kitchen counter, pouring water into a kettle. She didn't look at him, but she said, "They're going to keep coming. The stories, the assumptions, the manipulation. I'll shield you," he said without hesitation. She shook her head. "No, you won't. You'll stand beside me. That's different." And with that, a fragile thread of trust reappeared between them. In the days that followed, they strategized, not as father and daughter, but as allies. Hollis released a statement, not through his company, but personally. No press agents, no spin. Just a simple video filmed in a quiet room where he looked into the lens and said, "Her name is Sable Marin. She is my daughter. And the only thing scandalous about her is that I wasn't part of her life until now. That was my mistake. I will not allow others to rewrite her story." It went viral in under 12 hours. For the first time in a long time, people saw Hollis Keene not as a brand, but as a man who had missed something precious and was trying, publicly, earnestly, to make it right. And they saw Sable not as a scandal, but as someone strong enough to step out of silence and into the storm. He met her for coffee the morning after the story aired. She didn't say much at first, but when she finally looked at him across the small cafe table, something in her expression had changed. "I don't trust you," she said. "Not completely. Maybe not for a long time." "I don't expect you to," he replied, "but I believe you're trying, and that's more than I thought I'd ever get." He reached for his coffee, hand trembling slightly, and said, "Then let's keep trying." And together they began again. Not with certainty, not with peace, but with the quiet promise that this time, neither of them would walk away when it got hard. The sky that morning was unusually clear for late October. Pale sunlight poured through the large windows of Hollis's study, hitting the polished floorboards in long golden streaks. The air held the faint scent of cedar and paper. He had always preferred real books to screens when it came to anything personal. That morning, however, he couldn't focus on anything. Not the headlines, which had shifted from scandal to speculation. Not the cautious congratulations from board members relieved that the storm hadn't drowned the company. Not even the tentative warmth in Sable's most recent text. "That video was the bravest thing you've ever done. Don't let it be the last." What consumed him wasn't the present. It was the unopened envelope he had found buried in an old box in storage, one he had nearly thrown out during a half-hearted attempt to declutter. It was labeled in handwriting he instantly recognized. Slanted, elegant, impatient in the way that always made her ease curl too high. It was from Rowan. He sat with it for nearly an hour before finally slicing the flap open. Inside was a single page, folded 3 times, and a photograph, one he had never seen. Rowan holding a newborn, wrapped in a knitted blanket. Her eyes looked tired, but filled with a kind of joy he had only ever seen in glimpses during their time together. The baby's face was turned slightly, but he didn't need to see the details. He knew instantly it was Sable. There was something haunting in the way Rowan held her, protective, tender, and utterly alone. The letter was dated 2 months after Sable's birth. Hollis, I almost came to see you today. I even made it to your office building. I stood in the lobby with Sable in my arms, her head tucked into my neck, and I watched the elevators light up like little lies. I saw you walking through the glass doors with someone else, tall, beautiful, wearing your coat like she belonged in it. You smiled at her, the kind of smile I remember from nights on rooftops and mornings with burnt coffee, and I realized in that moment that I didn't want to be the woman who begged for space in a life that had no more room for me. You always told me you were chasing something bigger. I thought maybe if I waited long enough, I'd become part of that vision. But motherhood taught me something you never could. Some things don't fit inside plans. Some things demand to be chosen, even when it's inconvenient. I won't ask you for anything. Not for her, not for me. But I want you to know she exists. That she is fierce and soft and everything I ever wanted to preserve about the world, even when it tried to break me. I'll raise her on my own, not because you don't deserve to know her, but because you didn't ask. And I refuse to offer her to a silence. If someday you find this, I hope it's because you're finally ready to be someone's father. Not just a man who builds legacies, but one who holds them. And if you are, maybe she'll let you in. R. Hollis folded the letter slowly, pressing the creases flat with the edge of his hand. He felt hollow, not in the way of emptiness, but in the way of echoes. Like everything he'd missed was ringing inside him now, louder than anything he could say. The photograph slipped from the desk to the floor and he picked it up, turning it over. A note in pencil on the back read, Sable, 6 weeks. Favorite song, The Ceiling Fan. He laughed, the sound cracking through the quiet like a confession. Then he cried. Not the quiet, composed kind of weeping he'd permitted himself at funerals and crises past, but a full, shaking unraveling of breath and regret and something too long locked away. Later that afternoon, he sent Sable a message. There's something I want you to see, if you're willing. She responded within minutes. I'm free after 6. He picked her up himself. No driver, no assistant. She met him outside her building, wearing a thick knit scarf and gloves that didn't match. She didn't ask questions, just got in the passenger seat and watched the skyline shift as they drove. He brought her not to an office, not to his home, but to a private storage unit, one he hadn't opened in over a decade. Inside, it smelled like dust and time. There were boxes labeled with years instead of names. But in the far corner, he had laid out a table with a letter and photo waiting under a single desk lamp. She approached slowly. When she saw the photograph, she froze, then picked it up as though it might break. That's her handwriting, she whispered. Yes, Hollis said quietly. She was going to tell me, but she didn't. She thought she saw enough to assume I had moved on. Sable stared at the image for a long time, her fingers tracing the edge. You were with someone else. I was, he admitted, but not the way Rowan thought. It was complicated. I told myself I had already lost her, and I didn't fight to keep what I should have. She nodded and the silence between them shifted again, less sharp, more fragile. She thought she was protecting me, Sable said, setting the photo down. But maybe she was also protecting herself. I think she was terrified of asking and being told no. She deserved more than what I gave her, Hollis said. And so did you. Sable looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time she didn't seem angry. She looked like someone carrying something heavy who was finally deciding to set it down. I'm not here for your guilt, Hollis. I came into your life to ask a question, not to heal you. But I think I'm ready to let you try. He nodded once. Then I'll try. Every day for as long as you'll let me. And as the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting shadows across old boxes and second chances, Sable picked up the letter again and folded it with care. She placed it in her bag, not to run from it, but to carry it forward. Neither of them spoke as they left. They didn't need to. Some beginnings don't start with grand gestures. They begin with truth finally read aloud, and the quiet decision to keep going anyway. Winter came early that year, settling into the city with the kind of quiet that blanketed everything, even noise. Snow fell not in chaos but in soft, steady curtains, muting the streets, burying corners, and slowing people down whether they liked it or not. For Hollis Keene, it was the first time in decades that he allowed the season to change him. He wasn't flying out to Europe for holiday deals. He wasn't on magazine covers with glowing forecasts about the next fiscal year. He wasn't attending galas or rubbing shoulders with politicians who spoke in billion-dollar code. Instead, he was waking up earlier. He was brewing his own coffee, and he was walking without a driver, without an earpiece, without anyone knowing where he was headed. Most mornings, those walks ended in the community center on Halsted Street, where Sable taught, where children spilled into practice rooms like they had no idea what kind of city surrounded them. He would arrive before the doors opened and help set up chairs or tune instruments, careful never to overstep. He wasn't there to rescue anything. He was just present. Sable had started calling him Hollis again, not out of coldness, but comfort. It seemed easier, for now, than anything more intimate. But their conversations were less guarded. She began sharing pieces of her compositions with him before they were finished. He'd sit with headphones on, listening to tracks she claimed were just experiments, but which carried within them something ancient and aching. One afternoon, he asked her if she'd ever considered making an album. She shrugged. "Who would listen to it?" she said. "People don't know how to sit still long enough to hear anything that doesn't follow a beat." "I would," he said. "I'd listen." She looked at him for a long time before nodding once. That was all. In early December, he received a letter, not an email, not a memo. A real stamped envelope with a wax seal, addressed in tight handwriting. It was from the board of the Keene Foundation, inviting him to the annual Winter Gala. It would be his first appearance since the leak, the scandal, the DNA statement, and the storm that followed. The event would be full of allies and enemies disguised as donors. Meredith warned him he didn't have to go, that his image had finally begun to stabilize, and that attending might ignite more curiosity than goodwill. But Hollis already knew what he wanted to do, and more importantly, he knew who he wanted to ask. He waited until the next day, when Sable was sitting cross-legged on the floor of her office, sorting sheet music with the intensity of a surgeon, her glasses sliding down her nose. He held out the invitation. She stared at it, then back at him. "Is this a trap?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's a step. I want them to see you. I want them to see me with you. Not because it's a performance, but because I'm done pretending my life started with my company." She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was an ornate card with silver-embossed lettering, detailing an evening of cocktails, live music, and winter charity auctions. She traced the words with her fingertip, then placed the card down and said, "I don't have anything to wear." "I'll take care of it," he said, "if you'll let me." She hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but I'm wearing boots." And she did. The night of the gala, she arrived not in a limousine, but in Hollis's car, which he drove himself. She wore a simple navy dress, elegant in its restraint, with a long wool coat and the most unapologetically worn-in black boots he'd ever seen. Her hair was pinned in a way that made her eyes look impossibly large. She wore no jewelry. She didn't need it. When they walked in together, the room paused. Not dramatically, not like in a movie, but subtly. A shift in air, a hush in conversation. Cameras turned, whispered recognition sparked behind glasses of champagne. Hollis didn't flinch. He placed a hand gently at the center of her back, not to guide her but to ground himself, and led her through the room like he was stepping into it for the first time, as someone else entirely. Sable spoke to no one unless they spoke to her first. When asked what she did, she didn't embellish. "I'm a musician," she said. "I teach." She didn't use his last name. She didn't reference her parentage, but she smiled when people said her presence was unexpected. And when one particularly condescending philanthropist asked if she had ever performed professionally, she looked them in the eye and said, "Only when the stage is worth it." Hollis had never felt pride like that before. Not in stocks, not in IPO launches, not in being listed as one of the top 10 most influential minds in tech. This was different. This was clean. Later in the evening, there was a short interlude for music, always a feature of the gala, though often overlooked by the donors in favor of mingling and martinis. But this time, the organizers asked Sable if she would perform. She hesitated, then said yes. She took the stage without ceremony, her boots echoing against the marble. She tuned quickly, nodded once to the room, and began. The piece was unfamiliar, original likely. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but soon it swelled into something bold, tender, aching. A song written by someone who had seen the edge of things and chosen to come back. When she finished, there was silence. Real silence. No chatter. No glasses clinking. And then, applause. Hollis stood first. He clapped not because it was expected, but because it was involuntary. Others followed. It was not thunderous, not wild, but it was real. Afterward, as they walked back to the car beneath the brittle night sky, their breath fogging in the air, Sable said, "That's the last one, okay?" "What do you mean?" "No more galas, no more photos, no more stages. I did this for you, but I don't need their validation." He smiled, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "You didn't need mine either." "No," she agreed, "but I think I wanted it anyway." They drove in silence for a while. The city passed slowly outside the windows, golden and ghost-like. Before she got out, she turned to him. "You did something brave when you let me in," she said, "and you didn't have to." "I did," he said. "I just didn't realize it until it was almost too late." She opened the door. Snowflakes were beginning to fall again. "You were late, Hollis," she said with a smirk. "But I'll give you this. You stayed." And with that, she disappeared into the night, violin case slung over her shoulder, boots crunching softly on the sidewalk. He sat there for a moment, watching. Then he smiled, small, tired, and utterly real. Because for the first time in a life built on futures, he had finally chosen to live in the present, and that made all the difference.